The glow from my Mac's monitor didn't just light up the room. It felt like it was ionizing the air. I was 16, sitting in an art room in Freeport High School, hunched over a Mac G5 that was literally chugging under the weight of the file that I was building, pushing Photoshop to its absolute breaking point. Dozens and dozens of layers deep, cosmic textures so dense the processor would hang for a few seconds every time I moved a brush. And I wasn't just a junior in advanced placement art anymore. I was a goddamn cartographer of the infinite, mapping out territories that hadn't been discovered yet, using pixels as my only weapon against the quiet, suffocating boredom of my ordinary Midwestern high school. And while the other kids were out editing their skateboard videos or recreating logos from their favorite sports teams, I was lost in the physics of a black hole that I had built from scratch. And I wasn't just making space art. I was reaching into the guts of the universe and pulling out handfuls of neon stardust, hot and heavy and completely lawless. I had magenta nebulas bleeding into deep, impossible violets, a bruised electric sky that felt like it was still being born, stars layered upon stars, math and light colliding in a sensory riot that wasn't design, it was transcription. I was tapping into a frequency I wasn't supposed to have access to yet. Like a broadcast from the edge of a black hole, transmitted through my school's T1 connection into a cornfield town where in 40 minutes or so, I would find myself sitting in another class, probably a math class, where my brain would inevitably be back in my stars, the cosmos. The work that I was creating, it was a beautifully fucked up kind of wonder. The depth was so thick, it felt like it had its own gravity. I was building worlds where the light didn't just fall, it ached, and I was high on it. A teacher, a guy named Mr. Castro, a Marine vet who looked like he could drop out of the ceiling and snap your neck like a chicken bone, or paint you a masterpiece, appeared at my shoulder with two women I didn't recognize. Turns out they were faculty from the Art Institute of Chicago. I didn't even hear them come in. And this is Patrick, Mr. Castro said in a proud tone. Patrick does a bunch of stuff with these computers that I didn't even know was possible. They sat down. They leaned in. So what motivated you to make this? One of them said. Honestly, I don't know, I said, giving a very unsatisfying teenage answer. I guess I started to play around with Photoshop and I started to make something that looked kind of like space, so I just went in that direction. The other asked where the light came from, how I created that specific texture in the light. Oh, yeah, that. Well, I figured out if you add monochromatic grain in a color gradient, it creates that effect, I said, now feeling a little insecure about it. Feeling like they were just blowing smoke up my ass. And as Mr. Castro and one of the women were talking behind me, the other woman, who must have been in admissions, I guess, leaned in and said quietly, "Hey, you're the kind of student that we're looking for. Please, please apply. We have a new digital media program that I think you'd be great for." Later that month, Mr. Castro had that piece that I was working on printed as a part of the AP art show at a local art museum. It was displayed next to pastel drawings of flower fields and ceramic bowls. It looked like a monolith that had fallen from a higher civilization. And then, that particular light in my life went out. And I walked away. I walked away from it all. Well, my name is Patrick Fuller, and this is the Terrible Creative Podcast, where we have honest conversations about creativity, identity, and finding your voice. Today, it's episode 62. I'm calling it Subterranean, or On Obsession Part 2. So last episode, we talked about what obsession looks like from the outside. I talked about Michelle and Andrew, two photographers in a room in San Diego, who reminded me what it looks like when someone has found their thing and followed it past the point of reason. This episode, however, is about where that thing actually comes from, how it grows, what buries it, and how you learn to read it when it's still underground. Today, we're talking about three things. We're talking about the reoccurring anger, the involuntary attention, and the dismissed unserious. And hey, if this is your first episode, I just want to say welcome. Feel free to jump around. These are in no particular order, sort of. My email, amongst other things, are in the show notes. Be sure and check that out. So with all that being said, let's get into it.
It's not passing fascination now. It's obsession. It's obsession. It's obsession. It's obsession. It's obsession.
So there's a concept from 19th century psychology called monomania, which, as they define it, is a singular consuming fixation. One idea, one pursuit, one question that won't let go. Or we might call it obsession. And at the time, doctors considered it a disorder, something to be treated, something to be managed back towards normalcy. But while the doctors were busy writing prescriptions, the artists and authors of the day were busy taking notes. They looked at some of these same monomaniacs or obsessives and didn't see an illness. What they saw was an engine. They realized these people weren't broken. They were just the only ones in the room who could see what was being built. John Updike drew a line about this, specifically about J.D. Salinger. He said this, quote, "The refusal to rest content, the willingness to risk excess on behalf of one's obsessions is what distinguishes artists from entertainers and what makes some artists adventurers on behalf of us all." And I want to spend a few minutes unpacking the difference between artists and entertainers, because I think it comes down to what Updike basically said, that obsession is the dividing line. The entertainer is the host. They make you feel comfortable. But the artist is an archaeologist of their own haunting. They don't just find a style, they find a site where something's buried, and then they start digging. They don't stop when it gets dark, and they don't stop when their hands start to bleed. They stop when they reach the bottom, even if it takes a lifetime. And to see what it looks like when a human being chooses the labor of the obsession over the safety of the paycheck, I want to look at two specific lives. American filmmaker and film producer David Lynch and composer, singer, songwriter Jon Batiste. Lynch has been chasing the same ghost of his for 30 years, while Batiste was born into a house where the ghosts were already literally family. We'll start with David Lynch. So David Lynch grew up in Boise, Idaho. And the way that he describes it, his childhood was essentially an Americana postcard. Sunshine, green grass, mowed lawns. He was an Eagle Scout from a small town America. And he says that without a hint of irony. That was his world. That was the surface. But then there was one night that changed everything. This is Lynch to tell you the story.
One night, I kind of have the feeling it was in the fall, and it was pretty late. Usually, my father would go outside and yell, "John, David!" And that would bring us home. But this night, it must have been, I don't know, close to that time. It seemed to be pretty late. I don't know what we were doing, but from across Shoshone Avenue, out of the darkness, comes this, kind of like a strangest dream. Because I'd never seen an adult woman naked. And she had beautiful, pale white skin. And she was completely naked. And I think her mouth was bloodied. And she kind of came walking strangely across Shoshone and came into Park Circle Drive. And it seemed like she was sort of like a giant. And she came closer and closer, and my brother started to cry. Something was bad wrong with her. And I don't know what happened, but I think she sat down on a curb crying. But it was very mysterious, like we were seeing something otherworldly. And I wanted to do something for her, but I was little. I didn't know what to do. And I don't remember any more than that.
You know, I think we like to believe that obsession is a choice. We think we pick a subject, go deep, decide to care, but Lynch is the proof of the opposite. Obsession isn't a choice. It's a directive. It's a moment that happens to you and then spends the rest of your life demanding an answer. And while Lynch found his on a sidewalk in Boise, for others, the obsession is already in the room before they even arrive. Which brings me to Jon Batiste. Jon Batiste was born into it. His father, Michael, played bass on the Chitlin circuit in the 60s and 70s, performing with Jackie Wilson and Isaac Hayes. His father co-founded the Batiste Brothers Band. 7 brothers, R&B, soul, funk, New Orleans music. The family dynasty spans 25 musicians across multiple generations in New Orleans history. He was playing drums with the family band at 8 years old. At 11, his mother suggested he switch to piano, so he took classical lessons every Saturday for 7 years. And in between lessons, he taught himself to play by transcribing video game music like Street Fighter, Final Fantasy, and Sonic the Hedgehog. Batiste was the heir to the New Orleans music dynasty, a legacy that stretched back generations. But even with all that history in his blood, he still had to find his own identity. Batiste went to Juilliard, the most prestigious conservatory in the world, the absolute peak of the serious musician framework. And when he showed up, he just didn't show up. He showed up with his melodica, and it was a problem. Here's Jon Batiste to tell you about it.
What happened to you at Juilliard?
Actually, this happened. So you see, is it? Now, You see, this is like a harmonica and a keyboard put together. My dad went to Japan when I was a kid and brought one back, and I played it everywhere that I would go. I would carry it around, and I would play it. In the Juilliard days, I would be playing this in the cafeteria and the subways, and they thought that I was out of my mind. Not to mention that wasn't the response they gave it when I played. It was more like, why is he playing a toy? Why is he carrying it around? And then I was also very much trying to discover, and I'd be curious, Boo, how you shaped your vision of yourself, feeling like an outsider. I felt like I was in those days shaping my artistry and also shaping the way that, okay, how do I communicate all this inside to the rest of the world? And it was super awkward. So, and it was like experimental, and there was just a lot happening that people didn't understand and I didn't know how to explain to them. Mm-hmm. So then it ended up being a thing where one day they asked me to speak to the psychologist because they thought either he's got to be on something or there's some mental instability that's happening. So that's what happened to me my first year at Juilliard. That was a symphony of events, a suite of mishaps, from falling out of my bunk to getting pneumonia and missing the first couple of weeks of school, to then fainting in the subway because I didn't know I had walking pneumonia, to then going back to school and getting sent to the psychiatrist. That was my first year in New York. Welcome to the Big Apple.
They thought he was out of his mind. Think about this. One of the most, arguably, gifted musicians of our generation was sent to a psychiatrist because he wouldn't stop playing a plastic toy in the cafeteria. To the people inside Juilliard, Jon's obsession looked like instability. But to Jon, the melodica was the bridge. It was how he was learning to communicate all the stuff inside to the rest of the world. That's the hallmark of monomania. To the outside world, the obsessive looks broken. They look like they're on something, but really, they're just refusing to compromise their art for your comfort. Jon had pneumonia. He was fainting in subways. He was falling out of bunk beds, a literal symphony of mishaps. And yet, he still wouldn't put that toy down. Because when the obsession is that strong and clear, you don't care if the room thinks you're crazy. You just keep going. Not because you want to, but because you need to. Like you're in a flow of something powerful, something dangerous, something that people in your life may not understand. And with Batiste, he didn't rebel from his family roots. He ran them through everything. New Orleans tradition, through classical training, through Juilliard, through jazz, through whatever he could get his hands on. The obsession wasn't any of those things. It was the question underneath them all. How do you use music to connect people to each other? In 2011, his band recorded an entire album on the New York City subway train. And it wasn't for a concept, it wasn't for content, but because he was sitting with one question. How do you reach people who aren't already in the room? He carries that melodica into the subway stations and plays for strangers, not for the clip or the gram or out of ego, but because the music has to exist in the room with people. The dynasty gave him the roots, but the obsession grew in a direction that nobody in the family had gone before. David Lynch's obsession found him on a sidewalk when he was a kid. Batiste's obsession was planted in him before he was born and grew in a direction that nobody expected. But neither of them woke up one morning and decided what to care about. which is what I think most people get wrong about obsession, right? We treat it like a choice, like something that you select from a list of available interests and then commit to, right? Pick a niche, go deep, and then obsess. But that's not what obsession actually is. Obsession isn't chosen. It surfaces. The roots grow underground for years sometimes, fed by accumulated experiences, unresolved questions, training and learning, and anger that keeps returning, or curiosity that won't quiet down. What eventually breaks through is just the visual tip of something that's been building for far longer than you know. You don't stumble into obsession. You stumble into the first moment that you're willing to follow. You know, I've been thinking about my own root system lately, and I want to give you some Patrick IV lore here. A part of my life I don't talk about much anymore, but, and this might surprise some of you, at one point I thought I was meant to be a pastor. It started in 10th grade. I followed a girl to a youth group on the edge of town. It always starts with a girl, right? And it was mostly because her brother had a car and I wanted to be near her. It was a small hormonal decision that set me on a path I wouldn't return from for 2 decades. And the church came with a framework, you know, a rigid, high contrast definition of what was acceptable. And my creativity, my art, was suddenly valued, but only within the parameters of that space. At 17, when the world is big and terrifying and confusing, a framework doesn't feel like a cage. It feels like a life raft, you know? It made me feel like I belonged to something, like I was a part of something bigger than myself. That's when my art shifted. It moved from that lawless, arbitrary, cosmic, nebulous into something more practical, something that could be leveraged to communicate a message. By 19, I was an intern at another church. I met a guy named Josh, the communications director. He was a graphic designer who rode motorcycles, who went rock climbing, and he was the first person I ever really wanted to replicate. He taught me information architecture, graphic design, but he also taught me how to ride a motorcycle, how to rock climb. I find myself mirroring his style, clean but edgy. I was building a foundation for a career, but I was also building a life on someone else's blueprints. Then came the factory floor. My first real job was at a newspaper in Dubuque, Iowa. I was a junior designer, and I learned the dirty, boring, blue-collar side of design. I spent my days swapping out pricing data for used car dealers and graining out bumper photos for half-page ads. Then came marketing teams, bigger roles, higher stakes, design first, graphic designer, senior designer, then art director, and then photography. It was the same workflow, it's different tools, but I always was working for a brand. I was always operating inside a framework of what the work needed to be to satisfy someone else's bottom line. And then the algorithm arrived. Trends, formats, velocity. 3 distinct frameworks. 3 different sets of rules, and somewhere underneath all of them, this 16-year-old in Freeport, Illinois was still sitting in front of that screen, waiting for permission to finish the universe that he started. And as I was outlining this episode, just a little side note, I had this disturbing thought. And I've been sitting with it for a few weeks now. Because up until a few years ago, just literally a few years ago, the last artistic act I performed purely for myself, without a framework, without a client, without a rule book, was that cosmic project in 2001. How fucking nuts is that? That's why I'm so passionate about this stuff. Because for 20 years, I decalibrated my own soul. I brainwashed myself into believing that creativity was only valuable if it was practical or shareable or monetizable. I wasn't an artist. I was a high-level compliance officer. And that pisses me off. I feel like it's an artistic injustice, right? A theft of a signal that was silenced because I wanted to belong to the framework more than I wanted to belong to the work. Last week, I talked about the bathroom shoot, the image of the topless model sitting on that toilet, reading a fashion magazine in a San Diego apartment. And that was the first time since I was 16 that I made something just because I thought it should exist. Something that wouldn't be approved by a pastor or a boss, my parents, or even the Instagram terms of service. And it was in that moment, it felt like I had been driving in second gear for a lifetime and suddenly downshifted into fourth. It felt like relearning how to walk after 20 years of being confined to a wheelchair. And I can trace everything I've made lately, the photos, the podcast, the words, back to one singular engine. And it's not photography. It's not content. This might sound bad, but I'm going to say it's resentment. It's a deep, burning anger against other people's definitions of what the work, my work, is allowed to be, who I was allowed to be. And when I sat on that library floor in downtown San Diego at San Diego Central Library, pulling musty photography books off the shelves, I wasn't looking for inspiration, even though at the time I thought I was. I think looking back, I was looking for permission. I was looking for a way back to that seat in the Freeport High School art room, a seat that was interrupted by hormones, a rigid face system, and a corporate framework that kept my spirit restrained to what was safe and approved. And those grainy, black and white images of women half naked smoking cigarettes on Russian iron balconies, they didn't ask for permission. They were a broadcast from this different world. And they taught me that maybe I shouldn't ask for permission either. The obsession was already there. The frameworks, those 3 frameworks, they just buried it. And the work that I'm doing now, the work with the podcast, the book, my own photography, it's the signal slowly breaking the surface that had been buried for decades. Okay, so you've been sitting there listening to my story, my lore, right? You've heard about Jon Batiste and David Lynch. And you might be asking the question, how do you find yours? How do you find your obsession? If you want to know the honest answer, I would say this. You aren't looking for something new. It's your job to start to unearth parts of yourself that have been buried for maybe years and years. But I know what some of you are thinking. You're sitting there thinking, Patrick, I don't have a bloodied woman in the dark. I don't have a melodica. I'm just fine. I'm just living my life. Like, I don't really have some past or history. I don't think there's anything below the surface. And I used to say that too, you know. I spent 20 years saying that while I made shit for other people and convinced myself this is who I am. This is all I'm capable of. And worse, the value of my creativity is determined by other people who would pay me, or an algorithm that would make my work deemed worthy of being seen on an app. So Swiss psychiatrist and psychotherapist Carl Jung, who I talk about a lot on this podcast, had a warning for people like you and me. He said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. If you feel empty or fine, it's usually not a lack of obsession. It's actually suppression. Because you haven't done the honest, scary work of looking at your own shadow, the parts of you that don't fit into the framework that you or your boss or your clients or your family or your friends or a culture approves of. You might feel like you're empty, but really, you've just paved over your true self and then built a life on it. And if you want to know what's underneath the pavement, in the dirt, in the messy but interesting parts of who you are, you have to look for the cracks. So here are 3 signals worth paying attention to. So number 1, the recurring anger. And I'm not talking about the general frustration with the world or the state of the world. I'm talking about that specific, localized heat that returns to the same subject over and over. The thing that makes you think, this should not be this way. For David Lynch, it was the rot under the lawn. For Batiste, it was the distance between the music and the people. Your anger sometimes isn't a distraction. It's more of a compass. It's the heat coming off of the thing that you were born to protect. Number 2, the involuntary attention. What does your eye go to before your brain has time to censor it? What are you reading about at 2 a.m. when you should be sleeping? What do you notice in a room before you notice anything else? This is the magnetic pull. It's your subterranean self trying to tell you where the gold is buried. And if you find yourself obsessing over the way the light hits a specific kind of brick, maybe, or the way a sentence is structured, or the way a musical piece is put together, don't dismiss it. That involuntary pull is the root system trying to find water. And number 3, this is where I think most of us live. The dismissed unserious. This is the one that usually hides in the shadow. These are the things that you've been told aren't serious enough for a, quote, professional career. The church said it wasn't acceptable. The brand said it wasn't marketable. The algorithm said it wasn't trending. And for me, it was the cosmic art. It's the podcast. It was the image of the model in the bathroom. We bury our truest obsessions because we've been embarrassed by them. We're afraid they make us look weird or unprofessional. But the things that you've been told are unserious are almost always the things worth following. But as I was writing this, here's the part that I sort of haven't wrapped my head around, I can trace my signal back to that Macintosh screen in my art room in Freeport. I could feel the resentment in my bones. I can see the gold, the obsession in that bathroom shoot with the model. But knowing where this signal comes from, I can trace it. And being able to follow it, know where it's going, are two different things. Because after 20 years of working inside other people's frameworks, trying to listen to my own signal, trying to find life underneath my own pavement is like trying to walk again after your legs have been confined to a wheelchair for decades. The muscles are atrophied. The balance is off. And this podcast, The Terrible Creative, the book, everything, they aren't the destination, I don't think. They are just the first signs of life in my life that have broken through the soil. They are the rough, jagged edges of something that has been underground so long, it's forgotten its own shape. Look, it's been 20 years, and I'm still figuring out what that 16-year-old was actually trying to make. And sometimes it takes that long, especially when you build a career, a life on the pavement that was safe and clear and approved. So I want to leave you with one more story. It was 2008. I was living in Los Angeles, sitting in a dark theater on a Saturday afternoon with some friends, watching Pixar's Wall-E. And there's a sequence in the film where the little robot has just watched his love, Eve, be taken up into the spaceship. And in this heroic, desperate, love-fueled act, he latches onto the outside of the hull as it tears through the atmosphere. And then they hit the void. And what follows is a sequence of pure, silent wonder. You see Wall-E reaching out his small mechanical hand to touch the rings of Saturn. Space dust twirling and dancing in his wake. Then the camera moves in close to his eyes, these binocular lenses, and you see the reflection of the nebula. Magenta, deep purple, red so thick it felt like a pulse. The shot pulls wide, and you see the ship suspended in a universe that is vast, honest, and textured. And then I felt a slingshot in my chest. Have you ever had a moment that violently yanks you back into a version of yourself that you haven't thought about in a decade? And sitting in that theater in Pasadena, California, I wasn't just in LA anymore. I was 16. I was back in that art room at Freeport High School. Because the uncanny resemblance between what I was seeing on the giant screen and the file that I built on that G5, that Macintosh, was profound. It really was a jump scare to my soul. That really was, at least in my head, what I was making before I knew what I was making. And I don't know what that means exactly. I just know it means something. It was an echo, I think, maybe of a signal that existed before the framework arrived. It was a moment of pure subterranean remembering, an obsession that had been buried so deep, it took a Pixar movie to remind me it was still breathing. But when the lights came up and I walked to the car, I didn't change my life. Not then. I just snapped back into the reality of the framework. I went back to my church jobs, back to the brands, back to being artistically dormant. I wasn't courageous enough yet to peer into the cracks of the pavement and see the universe that I had buried. But the signal never stopped broadcasting. It's been trying to surface ever since. In every bathroom shoot, in every grainy photograph, in every honest word I've managed to put into this microphone. And you probably have one too. Not mine, yours. The question isn't how to find it. The question is whether you're willing to get quiet enough to hear it. And then whether you're brave enough to follow that signal before you even understand where it's going. Because as John Updike said, the refusal to rest content, the willingness to risk excess on behalf of one's obsession is what distinguishes artists from entertainers and what makes some artists adventurers on behalf of us all. Go be an adventurer. Stay curious. Stay courageous. And yeah, stay terrible.